Well, good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to welcome back to Chatham House Angel Gurria, who, as you know, has been Secretary General of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development since 2006. And during his time, the OECD has worked to enhance its role in the provision of economic analysis and data needed to sharpen economic policies and also to improve their implementation. And it's also worked to ensure that the organization takes an important place in the institutional architecture supporting global economic governance. And the OECD has accordingly also been addressing itself to a variety of broader global issues, from climate change to sustainable development. And particularly under the Secretary General's leadership, it's been addressing itself to issues around international tax reform, anti-corruption measures, which I think was the subject of a previous talk given here at Chatham House, and the attempt to foster not only a concept but also to promote the reality of economic well-being, a form of economic well-being that recognizes its various and multiple contributing dimensions. Now, that sense of well-being has in the past few years been conspicuous by its absence in a number of developed economies, and compounded with the reality of stubborn economic inequalities. It's often seen to underlie many of the political grievances and forces that are critical of or hostile to globalization and its structures. So with that in mind, Mr. Gurria will today set out the requirement for inclusive growth strategies with a particular reference to the role of international trade and investment, and he'll present some thoughts on how inclusive growth can be promoted in respect of both domestic policy and multilateral initiatives. His remarks are on the record and they're being live streamed, so do tweet about them using the customary hashtag #CHEvents. So it just remains for me to ask Mr. Gurria to address us, and please join me in welcoming him to Chatham House. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Adam. I'm delighted to be back. It's always good to be in Chatham House, whatever the rules of the day. Let me say that all major regions of the world are enjoying a welcome expansion. I think this is a context in which what we're going to be talking about, and that's, somebody even used the word synchronized, which is very, very, probably too generous, because it's not that everybody agreed that they would do exactly all the right things in order to. We've been trying for 10 years now with a crisis. The crisis is 10 years old, remember. And we are celebrating the fact that we're growing at 3.9%. This year, maybe next year. And, well, some of us forget the fact that we were growing at 4% before the crisis. So, effectively, 10 years into the crisis, we are only reaching the level of growth and the speed of growth that we had before the crisis. The same has to do with employment, the same has to do with unemployment. So, let's say that we have now recovered the pre-crisis levels, and at the same time that it looks like this kind of growth can hold for the next couple of years. That's what our interim economic outlook of a few days ago was forecasting. On the job side, millions of new jobs are being created. That's good. Again, the legacies of the crisis were low growth, were high unemployment, were growing inequalities, and there's this collapse in trust in the institutions. So those four legs of the legacies of the crisis, if you will, are somewhat improving. I would say the first three is certainly the growth. Second, the jobs are improving in the United States, which has been a factory of jobs really over the last, now it's been 16, 17 million jobs in the United States that have been created in the last 6, 7 years. But even in Europe, this is improving. In the euro area, which had been sluggish in terms of the recovery, this is improving. And then when you're talking about the inequalities, we're going to be talking about the inclusive growth story. So I'll jump that, but I'll go to the fourth one, which is the question of trust, which is still lagging behind, which is still a big problem. Monsieur Legrand, bonjour. Now, despite these glimmers of hope, the multilateral system is under strain. Governments around the world are facing a public backlash against globalization. Actually, backlash against globalization has almost become a kind of a cliche, you know, which is very unfortunate, but that's the way it is. The benefits of globalization certainly not only are perceived not to have been distributed evenly, they actually have not been distributed evenly. And perhaps then we understand why there are so many angry people and why we get these very fragmented results. Because you're getting fragmented results on the economic side, which produce fragmented results on the political side, which produce fragmented results, well, because of the social implications. And then you get these, you know, 7 months to form a government in the Netherlands, 5 months to form a government, of all places, in Germany. The rather complex post-electoral situation in Italy. Did I say that elegantly enough? In, you know, some, rather complex post-election situation in Italy. And then, of course, we have Brexit, and we have the situation in the United States with all these expressions of, different manifestations of expressions of dissatisfaction. So you basically have it, you know, all over the world. We're having we're having 6 already. Some of them 2 already happened, but we're having 5 or 6 elections this year in Latin America. And again, they all are looking either very tight or complicated, etc. You know, with Brazil and Mexico, just had one in Costa Rica. That, I think, had a good outcome in the sense that it suggests continuity going forward. But it's you know, it's the same all over the place. There's nowhere to hide, in a way, from this dissatisfaction, sometimes anger, protest against the globalization that has not served everybody in the same way. Now, some countries are concerned that in this context of this unfair, if you will, globalization, that some countries are not playing by the same rules. Whether it's because of state support, subsidies, protection, and the fact that new multilateral rulemaking perhaps is not keeping pace with the realities of today's global economy. I'll give you an example. We are now under a lot of pressure to produce a blueprint for taxing digital. Oh. So everybody thinks it's about GAFA or FANG or whatever it is that you call it. No, it's about an increasingly globalized world economy. How we deal with, you know, there are some companies that specialize in digital issues or techniques or technologies, but basically you're talking about how do you tax an increasingly globalized world economy. This is the kind of thing that is, why? Because the man on the street perceives that he's taxed, and perhaps the richest man in the country is not, because he found a tax haven. Or the small and medium enterprise feel they're taxed, and perhaps the largest companies in the world are not taxed because they found a double something, you know. I used to say double Irish, double Dutch. They're gone. They're gone. Double Irish cannot happen again. Enda Kenny, went to the OECD and offered he would dismantle it. He did. And after that, we dismantled Double Dutch, and then we dismantled some of the facilities here in the UK, etc. So it's a better world today. But again, the question is, how does small and medium enterprise, how does a person feel? Again, feeding into this element of dissatisfaction. When you're talking about inequalities, well, 10%, the income of the 10% poorest fits 10 times into the income of the 10% richest. So what? What do these tens tell us? Would you be more worried if we told you that a generation ago the sign was 7%, was 7 times instead of 10 times? So the same number, instead of, 10 times the income of the poorest fits into the income of the richest, and it used to be 7 times only a generation ago. It has increased, inequality has increased by 40% in 1 generation. Very fast, obviously in the wrong direction. So that just tells you, it's documents. And also what happens when year in and year out income has these inequalities? Then the stock of wealth resulting from these flows of income accumulates in the same way. And also because of a number of technical reasons, capital tends to be better remunerated than labor. We've had this accumulation at the very top. And then, well, London knows about this when you very, very, very top, 1%, etc. It exacerbates the trend. So you have this is just evidence about the problem. I was always intrigued by the fact that in London or in Baltimore, it's a good, interesting pairing, there can be 10 to 15 years difference in terms of life expectancy, depending on the borough. Well, it just shows you the kinds of problems we have. But then the regional disparities are not just about income and revenue, they're also about productivity. In London, it rose by about 31% since 2005. And that's about a third more than in other regions in the UK itself. So that's just a little vignette. Then there's a question of distribution of skills and the structures of their economies. Because the question of skills, it used to be that, we would say education, education, education. Today it's skills, 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 which is a combination of education and lifelong learning and vocational training, etc. And that has a direct bearing on productivity, of course, together with other issues like, regulation, etc. And again, that is very badly distributed, and it's very susceptible to trade shocks. And as we have seen, and we recently published something up in the last couple of days that basically said those that are more at risk and those who are going to be more affected by the digitalization movement are going to be those that have the lower skills. So the question of skills, upskilling, reskilling, etc., is a question of survival. It's not just a question of being better paid. There are also other, the other manifestations of these problems. The Panama Papers, the Paradise Papers, which suggests that some people were not paying taxes at all. The difficulties between the EU and Apple, for example, the 0.05% tax rate on Apple. Not bad. It's a nice, comfortable tax rate. But what happens? You suddenly have the paradox that Ireland is suing in order not to get the money, the 13 billion. Why? Because Ireland does not want to be seen as, the country that is taxing the companies, etc. Basically, substantially, that money is of the U.S. Exchequer, well, maybe if now that they've changed the rules, and it'll make it a little easier to repatriate, etc. But what I mean is that you had all these distortions which added to the problem, what they call the geographies of discontent. Now, so what to do? This is the diagnosis. Well, rebuilding trust in the multilateral system and the policy-making process itself. Recognize that traditional growth models have failed to deliver for many people, that there is heightened financial volatility. This may be good for the traders, but not for the man on the street, if you will, or the woman on the street, to be politically correct. And then there's a question of, are we doing all this while protecting the environment, while taking care of the environment? Now, we're talking about trying to give everybody the same opportunities. How do we come up with the question of inequality? We documented inequality in a book that we produced in 2008 already called Growing Unequal, question mark. In 2011, we eliminated the question mark, unfortunately, because we confirmed, and we called it Divided We Stand. And then in 2015, we wrote another opus called In It Together, suggesting that it was very important that we actually do this, with a collective. So once we had diagnosed all the causes of this inequality, you say, what do you do? Well, the policy response to that is inclusive growth. You had to have some response. So after diagnosing and squaring the thing and measuring the thing and comparing a thing and, benchmarking the thing, it said, so what do you do? You say, well, inclusive growth. Inclusive growth. Now, inclusive growth is now, again, been picked up in so many quarters and so many expressions and so many, but the fact that it may be sometimes abused as a concept should not take away from our fully appreciating its value and its importance. So we should throw everything we've got at it in order to get an inclusive growth. First of all, we got instruments, the policy framework for investment, our principles on responsible business conduct, our guidelines for multinational enterprises, our anti-bribery convention, etc. And many of these have been adopted now by the G20, for example. So now they're G20 OECD principles on multinational guidelines, whatever. And the good thing when the G20 adopts it is you get 3 billion more clients. You get all the Chinese and all the Indians and all the Brazilians and all the Argentinians and if you're not a part of the OECD, and basically it means these countries commit to deliver on these agreements or these conventions or these guidelines, etc. And at least you have a better shot at having more countries practicing them. Then the question is, how can you make it work for everybody? And here you're having problems of regional development, but you're also having problems of individuals, of people. How do you actually get the people? How do you empower the people? Again, there's a question of the education system, yes, but there's also a question of the skills. And then there's a question of whether the opportunities and the skills and the health and the basic education and the access and the quality of both education and health, etc., really transform or become opportunities for good quality work, decently paid work, and to what extent this is not happening and what can we do about it. Then there's a question about the role of the state. The role of the state as a great leveler, as a great equalizer, and then the role of the private sector in terms of, under the context which the state has drawn, to be able to work in the direction of strengthening this inclusive growth approach. Now, I have to say, when you talk about to a group, and the group is on average younger. They will tend to be more cynical in terms of whether the private sector will actually move in the direction of something like inclusive growth. And my answer to them is always, look what is happening with the question of green. The companies are now competing, remember, equal opportunity employer, that's men, women, okay? Then in multinational companies, the national diversity, okay? Ethnic diversity, all sorts of diversities. And then, of course, the question now is, when you're talking about the Paris Agreement and you're talking about emissions, now companies are, number one, they are working on disclosure to see how green they are. And now they're kind of competing on disclosure because consumers are doing their thing. Consumers are rewarding companies that do it well and not rewarding companies that not do it so well. Some big investment funds like the Norwegian Investment Fund no longer work with coal, for example, things like that. So it is becoming part of the culture. It's becoming part of, and it doesn't have to be necessarily legislated. And then it becomes legislated in many places. So this moves more and more, and so to be perceived as, moving in the direction of inclusive growth and having proper conditions of pay, proper conditions of training, proper conditions of, supporting the creche, the daycare centers for the women that work in the company, all are good for the employees, but they also improve the productivity, and they prove to be a very positive thing for the people themselves. So I think, it's a win-win, if you will. The employees win, the company wins, and there's a loyalty that is established. The problem with informality that abounds in developing countries is that you do not create this bond. The worker does not think that they can go the extra mile to benefit the company, and the company will not invest in the employee because, well, maybe they will not have any contract after 3 months, after this short-term contract expires practically with no benefits. There's also so this is, at the national level, and there's also, regional level, the city level. Inclusive growth has so many dimensions, but just coordinating the national and the regional and the municipal level is just itself an art, a very complex and difficult art. But then how do you bring that to the actual international level? Well, we're always talking about the benefits of direct foreign investment, and for many years, low environmental and social standards were viewed actually favorably by investors looking to minimize costs. And of course, not only that these irresponsible investment practices erode the quality of the investment and the quality of the business environment, they resulted in economic losses, environmental degradation, in poor labor conditions, and the more serious cases like Rana Plaza in 2013, in loss of life. Now we've seen recently a most shocking case of people being bought and sold, and of course perhaps an extreme case, but exploitation by companies which said, I'm all responsible for the wall and the street where my company is. The rest is somebody else's responsibility. The global chain that actually connects me to produce, things in Bangladesh, or produce things in China, produce things in Vietnam, or things in Mexico, wherever they are, is not my responsibility. That nothing to do with me. And of course, that also is changing more and more. The companies are being, made accountable for that. So there's also what I would call what is happening to the international instruments. You probably have read that there is some tension on the trade front. But today, it came to a head because I was doing some interview in Bloomberg, and suddenly, breaking news, the two Chinese deputy ministers, one of finance and one of trade, were announcing the retaliation, the tit for tat in tariffs, not for the 3 billion package, but now for the 50 billion package, for the larger. One of the first thing I reflected was, it's interesting because China exports to the United States 500 billion, and the United States exports to China 150 billion. However, they're tit for tat 50-50. Now 50 is 1/3 of the exports of the United States to China. And 50 is only 1/10 of the exports of China to the United States. So it's interesting that the Chinese should have taken 15, actually, to be exactly proportional. Normally in diplomacy and in politics, the proportionality is something which is. But anyway, it just shows you that there are no particular rules. Clearly, they're not winners here. But the question is, when we're talking about inclusive growth, here we have a fiscal approach to inclusive growth. Making sure everybody pays their taxes. Inclusive growth happen, making inclusive growth happen. The productivity inclusiveness nexus, not just productivity, not just the growth, not just the inclusiveness, not just the redistribution, but the nexus between the two. This is what we, and then towards better trade policies, how to make trade work for all. Now, these are the kinds of things we promote. These are the kinds of things to leave nobody behind, but at the same time, to have nowhere to hide when it comes to paying your taxes or when it comes to multinationals, etc. The problem is that we felt that we were mainstream, and now we're feeling a little lonely because of all the things that are happening. And our conviction, of course, continues to be that we have to continue to promote the same values and continue to promote the same principles that we have defended over all these years. One of them critically being this inclusive growth approach to economics, to social issues, to the environment, and also to governance, because it is a very, wide, all-embracing concept that we should adopt in order to change the way we have been approaching globalization. Because, as I said before, it's not working too well so far, and it is creating all these results, all these unexpected economic, social, political situations where you get very thin and very vulnerable coalitions, and then you need one more, two more, three more parties in order to build a coalition. So then the same leader who was enlightened and was courageous, he sneezes to the left, the guys on the right get angry and they drop off from the coalition. You have to call another election, and then vice versa, This is the situation where we are today. So when we're talking about inclusive growth, it's not just about an ethical or a moral concept, which it is not just a, something which is, you know, divided between the good and the bad. It's also very practical, it's also very political, and it's also a very clearly economic issue. So we'll stop here, and we'll take the comments, questions, or violent objections.
Great. Thank you very much. Do you want to take the questions from the lectern or sit down? You're welcome to do either.
Probably here.
Okay, great.
Okay,
Let me just kick off then.
Please.
You began your presentation by referring to synchronicity in terms of the growth performance. Do you see synchronicity, at least within the OECD membership, on pursuing these strategies towards inclusive growth? You mentioned some of the challenges around coordinating them at the national, subnational, regional level, but do you see people within the membership of the OECD pulling at least in the same direction? And are there any exemplary cases of inclusive growth strategies that you would want to point to as a model for others to follow?
I think when we launched this idea, which was about 6 years ago, Romina is the one that is leading the charge with this particular part of our work. I think there was not only widespread support, and then we produced a number of, iterations. And the idea was not to make a book called Inclusive Growth and then saying that everything should be inclusive and everything is fine, and put it to the side and make a bunch of copies or put them out. But basically what I would call to mainstream the idea of inclusive growth in everything that we do, because our motto is better policies for better lives. And that means, with the exception of military, geostrategic type of, defense questions, we deal with practically every other policy, public policy, and including with many instruments that are applicable to the private sector or strictly applicable to the private sector, and which the private sector uses every day. They don't all know that it is an OECD instrument, or that it was put out 50 years ago. It's been upgraded many times during the years. But so I think there was this idea that this was the right way because it was an answer to the inclusive issue, to the exclusive issue. It was an answer to the inequalities. Remember what President Obama said. Inequality is the defining issue of, our generation, or something like that. So there was a lot of consensus. There was a lot of support, and we were actually asked to come up with it. I would say that today you have a more fragmented situation, a more fragmented view. Just like you have a more fragmented view about whether we should continue to deepen and strengthen multilateralism as an approach to problem solving. We, of course, continue to be convinced, and more than ever, and every day as we measure and we compare and we analyze, we become even more convinced that multilateralism is not only the way to go, but in many cases the only way to go. When you're talking trade, when you're talking investment, when you're talking climate change, when you're talking migration, how are you going to address these things other than through multilateralism? However, I would say it's not such a today such a strong unity of view about that, and I would say many countries are trying to go it alone, or perhaps by favoring the bilateral way, perhaps also to some extent frustrated because the multilateral way sometimes is very process oriented and sometimes does not produce results. I'll tell you a little example. The question of the overcapacity of steel. steel production in the world. Effectively, what you have is 2.4 million tons or something like that of steel production today, of which about a third is surplus. Now, how did we ever get into a situation where, well, it takes some time to build capacity, and some countries thought that we were going to continue to grow at, well, China was going to continue to grow with double digits, and the West was going to continue to grow at 5 or 6% or whatever, you know, and that would just keep on going and going and going, and also perhaps did not take into consideration the fact that per unit of GDP, perhaps the content of steel as is the content of energy, or as technology is driving that lower and lower. Fact of the matter is, we have today 1/3 of the world's capacity is surplus. Now, this started to create a lot of pressures and a lot of tensions in every single G20, G7, all the Gs, you know, and the WTO and everything else. So we decided in Hangzhou, in the context of the G20, the leaders, of course, it had been built up by the ministers, to create a global forum on excess steel capacity. And they asked the OECD to be the facilitator. And we established it, and we started working. And the first thing was information. You know, so everybody was kind of not only so dynamic in terms of providing the information, you had to go plant by plant information, capacity, how much capacity had been taken off, how much capacity was going to be taken off, what did everybody had to offer, etc. So complex, many parties, many countries, but making progress. But perhaps maybe it didn't happen just like that, that because you created a forum, you had the solution. Now, this is the only way in which you're going to solve the problem in depth. Why? Because if you don't deal with the problem of surplus capacity, you're only going to be shooting at the manifestations. So every 10 years, somebody's going to flare up and going to get another, you know, another tariff or whatever. You know, the other guy's going to answer with another tariff. And so if you don't deal with the problem of actually dealing with the, and also it's what type of steel, what markets, whether it's round or corner or, you know, wire or whatever it is, you know, it's specialized steel, whatever. It's not so simple. It needs a talk. Sit down and talk about it and really address the question. So we created this forum. Now, we were just starting to kind of warm up. And in Hamburg, we confirmed that the forum was fine. This was already with the new U.S. administration. And you know, it was confirmed, and we started working. We delivered a report in Berlin the end of last year, which was approved after some negotiation on the way forward. And then, of course, more recently, we had the setting of the tariffs. And then we had this limited setting of the tariffs as a response by the Chinese. And then there was, in the beginning, there was a tariff for everybody, and then there were all these exceptions, etc. So you know the story better than I. But there is, you know, there is a way, there is a place. And we created, when I say we, it's the same protagonists that today are, you know, putting tariffs on each other, that created. So my question is, why don't we give those institutions that we created, those bodies that we created, and we created them out of a little bit of, well, or a lot of frustration that maybe the more usual channels were not fast enough, were not good enough, were not, you know, dynamic enough. But even something like that doesn't produce results immediately. So, and then you had the tariffs. Now, it doesn't mean the thing is going to disappear because tariffs were installed. So hopefully, maybe this will be an incentive for the ones who are working on the global forum to accelerate, and we who are facilitating the work will certainly take that message. But that's an interesting example where You didn't go to the WTO, you created a special, and also because the WTO was not necessarily the place where you deal with excess capacity issues. You know, it's about commercial practices, or it's about protectionism, or it's about tariff things. So, well, you created a special body. But then you went through with the tariff. So there seems to be some contradiction in terms of, but it shows frustration.
Does it also demonstrate that there are instances in which political motives can override technical solutions to trade issues that arise? That there's a certain point at which those, on both sides of a dispute, the political momentum acquires a pace of its own. And how concerned are you that these two countries are going to get deeper into this process of tit for tat and leading to something that's larger and more significant? The issues of multilateralism, of coordination that you've been talking about effectively in today's world can't happen if China and the United States choose, and it may be a choice, not to agree to talk and to collaborate on them. Are you worried about this?
Well, of course we're worried. We worry about something every day. At 3 o'clock in the morning, you open your eyes and say, "Oh my, what am I going to worry about today?" No, this is very worrisome. I mean, it's not. Why? Because you're talking about the number 1 and the number 2 traders of the world. Well, actually, to be fair, the number 1 is the European Union together. That's the largest single trading bloc. One should not lose track of that, because it's important when you're looking at including the UK, so far. So, but the fact is that, of course, these are huge trading partners to the world, and the idea that it's just going to remain bilateral and remain sectorial doesn't really work like that. They're spillovers, and also their general consequences, general price results, and then sectorial, which may become non-competitive. Now, in this interview this morning, somebody wanted, just insisting to say, "But is this good for Europe?" You say, what's good for Europe? You know, that the United States and China are having this trade tension. And he said, no, it's not good for anybody. It's bad. He said, oh, but this may certainly be good for Mexico, because, you know, they're having an NAFTA, and then they will have. I said, no, this is bad. You know, it's a lose-lose proposition. It is not good because it shows that, first of all, this level of frustration that we were talking about, because here you had a combined effect. You had both a setting of tariffs, but also recourse to the WTO in terms of the licensing process. Now, I was in China last week, and of course, in China, you know, everybody was alarmed about, you know, that this whole thing was happening, but they were all preparing to respond. So then the focus, when these things happen, the focus changes from being more productive, for having more skills, for having more exports, for having stronger trading regimes, and more technology and more R&D, etc., to basically becoming defensive. And that wastes a lot of resources, it wastes a lot of energy and time and opportunities. And opportunities, you know, opportunities are never obvious in the balance sheet, but they you know, lost opportunities clearly belong in the liability side of the balance sheet.
Great. We'll open up the conversation to our members now. If anybody would like to ask a question, make a quick comment, raise your hand, wait for the microphone to reach you, and introduce yourself. Who would like to get us started? Yes, please, here in the front row.
Thank you. I am Ziya Altın Yıldız, representing Turkey MP and head of Grand Assembly, chairperson of Energy Trade and Industry. And I thank you for, I think, explanatory and analyzing the things that at the moment the world is going somewhere and nobody knows where we are going. And during the good times, international organizations look doing well. But if things going the other way around, then unfortunately, as we are having such problem today, international organization looks ineffective and doing something good to maybe put the right things for everyone, not to follow, but at least to deem to be follow the case, then the world is benefiting. As you rightly said, if there is something bad and there is a fighting in international arena in terms of international trade, some countries can look at the fighting, trade fighting, if I can benefit from this fighting. As you right said, nobody is gaining from international trade fighting. And when we analyzing liberal economy and international trade expansion have produced good things for disadvantaged region and countries and developing countries as well. But today, things are now going the opposite. What I mean is, so many issues are going well, and international organizations are not setting anything that those sort of problems can be or help easing those problems. And people think not only in the centric approach, but is a global approach. And the international organization is being, unfortunately, getting ineffective.
So you would like international organizations to do more?
Let me just put it this way. How do you see, as you rightly mentioned, how do you see the problem is I mean, which way the problem is going in the coming days? Yeah. And how developing countries can be affected from this situation, and what could be the real solution and getting out of this such crisis? Thank you.
Let me say, first of all, in the last 10 years, I've been head of the OECD for 12 now, and in the last 10 years, we've never been so much in demand, and it's growing and growing and growing and growing, sometimes even exponentially. Because precisely when the going gets difficult, it gets tough, and multilateral is a way in which countries, rather than acting individually, would rather put the problem and then say, okay, let's talk about it, let's discuss it, let's have a multilateral solution. There are very few countries that can start individual actions other than what I would call defensive actions. And they have to be very big, they have to be very important, and they have to be also very large numbers. You know, you have countries that are very large in terms of population, but are not so important in terms of trade or in terms of financial flows. So but you're both. You have large territory, large population, and especially large trade and financial connections. Then those countries could choose to use bilateral tools. But what's going on? Well, basically, we've run out of room. This is the problem. Monetary policy is reverting now. The United States is increasing the rates. The UK is kind of sitting on the fence, but not too far from, The Europeans hopefully will take a little longer. The Japanese also hopefully will take a little longer. But all I'm saying is there's a process towards normalization when it comes to monetary policy, having run a very large, space already. They did a lot. We owe to the central bankers homage. We should build a statue to them because they really helped us a lot. But again, they're running out of their tools. They've used their tools to the greatest. So what about fiscal? Well, don't we want less deficits and less accumulated debt? The new problem today is not that you have a lot of public debt in some cases, 240% of debt to GDP in Japan, 180% in Greece, maybe 130%, whatever, in Italy. No, 100% average at the OECD. 100% average of the OECD. The problem is that you can't really use that anymore because there's also a household buildup of debt and there's a corporate buildup of debt. And that is starting to worry some people. So you're trying to cut the deficit and cut the accumulated debt, and the markets are making sure, breathing down your neck so that you do that, otherwise they bring down your rating. So what is the third leg, the one other leg that is left? Education, innovation, regulation, competition, gender issues, your tax regime, your health system, your trading system, your investment system, your digital, your innovation. That means what we collectively call the structural change. And the problem with structural change is that 1 is 1, 2 is like 5, and 3 is like 25. It accumulates, it's mutually reinforcing. The more you do, the more you benefit. But the other thing is, the more the others do around you, there'll be also a multiplication of the benefits. This is, again, why I would say stay on the multilateral side. Smaller countries, developing countries will benefit from multilateral simply because they can level the playing field. And the larger countries will not have to do themselves this bilateral prodding, but use the organizations, the institutions that were created for this particular purpose. Now, we always have development countries in our mind. We always have developing countries. When Mexico joined, when Chile joined, and other countries are now joining, Colombia will join this year, Lithuania will join this year, Costa Rica will join next year, and now we had Brazil, Argentina, and Peru asking to join the OECD. Why? It's not because they're developed countries. It's mostly because what they're saying, they would like to be in the group that produces the standards for the rest of the world. And, this is a way. So I would say that, again, in the face of uncertainty, I would say more multilateral, more multilateral, more multilateral.
Thank you. We have about 5 more minutes. It's time for one more question, I think, possibly. Yes, you, sir, with your hand up.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much for a wonderful talk. My name's Vincent Neat. I'm a member of Chatham House. I think your answer to the question that I want to pose you might be more multilaterals. But going back to the issue of the steel, if we're producing 1/3 of more steel than we need in the world, then my sort of natural capitalist tendency is just to say, well, that's a lot of steel companies that need to go bust. And I understand that, therefore, countries don't want it to be their steel companies, so they start whacking on tariffs and saying, you have to buy my steel, or I'm not going to buy your steel, etc. But it seems to me that over the years, we've never actually tried a global system on the basis of saying, well, actually, you know, when we all get together, we can talk about this as much as we like, but the reality is that if we make 1/3 more steel than we need, then jobs have got to be lost somewhere. It's going to have to happen. Why not let the market decide? Which leads me to thinking that your answer would be something about multilateral institutions. And a second part to the question, which is, are there not too many of them? Because there do I get very confused even thinking about economics, but when I start thinking about it in the context of all the multilateral institutions, my poor little brain is totally lost.
Yeah. First of all, you're right. I would say go multilateral. And number two, I would strongly disagree that there are too many multilateral organizations. I think there are organizations that are more effective than others, because what the members want is what happens in multilateral organizations. It's not that they have a life of their own. You know, sometimes leadership counts. Sometimes you can have a director or a head or a managing director who is more effective than others. But basically, it's what the members want to do with it. But then the third is that, no, I don't agree. You did not guess very well what I was going to say. And the reason is the following. You are right that all you would have to do is just let the least effective producers go bankrupt. If we had a market, and market signals, and market prices, and market rules. What happens when, in a particular country, those signals do not matter or do not necessarily lead to, say, closing or firing tens of thousands of people, as they would in the United States, or as they would in the UK, or as they would in Mexico, actually have had in Mexico. Why? Because some countries have either state support, or sometimes it's regional support, sometimes it's even city support. And there's so many jobs connected to the particular, maybe the only big industry in the town or whatever it is, that it becomes a very political issue. And the shareholders are not responding in the same way in which normal shareholders would respond in London in an assembly of shareholders. They're basically saying, don't shut it down. Otherwise, we will vote you out the next time. They're not saying we're losing money, and therefore the taxpayer has to. They're basically saying we, the taxpayers, will sustain. So it's the opposite logic, and therefore what you have, if not everybody is playing by the same rules and not everybody is actually applying the same logic, then you have the distortions. This is why when you're thinking of a multilateral solution, it is because those who have the different views of how to do this have to get together and also listen to the other guys and say, hey, you're killing me, you know. And say, but then, you know, I am who are receiving the, you know, the subsidies or the support or whatever. It's saying, yes, but please understand, you know, there's nothing else in that small town. What am I going to do with it? So, and how much time do you give me? And how much, these things have to be discussed and talked about and understood by the others, because if not, what you get then is this frustration that turns into unilateral actions, and then retaliation, and then tit for tats, and then you get into this kind of a downside. So this is the difference in this particular case. and that is that it's not necessarily, or I would say clearly in this case, in the case of steel in particular, not market-driven. And to the extent that it's not market-driven, then you don't have the same signaling systems as you go down the road. Maybe a last one?
I think I'm under strictures from your colleagues to bring this to a timely conclusion.
Okay, so I'm under
You've
her,
covered a lot of ground.
control.
An hour for the global economy is just not enough. We didn't even get into the question of what your verdict is on the economic effects of Brexit, which is usually a question that pops up.
We published a book on that, and unfortunately we were right. And when I was campaigning against Brexit, I have a son who lives in Cambridge and who is a husband of a neuroscientist. He works for Cambridge University. She is a neuroscientist at Sanger Institute. They have two lovely British children, so they're all 4 British subjects. 2 of them pay taxes. And I was not only fighting because the OECD was fighting for, multilateral solutions, but basically because I wanted them to be, European, citoyens du monde, et cetera, et cetera. And I went out and I said, what is the worst thing that I can find? What's the worst word that I can say, but, in public? So I said, the Brexit tax. So I said, the Brexit tax is going to be so many thousands of pounds per household, et cetera. We made this learned calculation, et cetera, et cetera. And unfortunately, well, we've been proven right, but the question is also that that particular discussion was not conducted necessarily on the basis of the more rational options. And neither was a question of migration, or neither was a question of regulation. So we lost it perhaps because our strong suit was showing the numbers and the evidence, and that was not what the discussion was about.
Well, it seems,
as Steve McQueen would say, it seemed like a good idea at the time.
But it seems like the UK is going to give you intellectual as well as family reasons to return. Come back to Chatham House again.
Hopefully.
I hope. Okay.
Yeah,
Thank you
so
very much indeed.